Hi, good afternoon. It's great to see people joining. Please say hello in the chat and let us know who you are, where you're from. Chat room is usually noisy during these sessions. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter if that's your thing, using the hashtag Waddscon. So thanks for joining this edition of Waddscon. Throughout 2020, we're exploring how public relations practitioners work with journalists. Today's session is going to be about data storytelling. Over the series, we've explored pitching, newsjacking, we've got promoting coverage to come, and measurement. Thanks to everyone on the board a ticket today. We've raised another 500 quid for our local food bank in Newcastle, much needed at this current time. Each of the speakers today is going to talk about a different aspect of using data to create and pitch stories to the media. We've just had a quick run through and you're in for a real delight today. We're joined by Emma Thwaites from the ODI, Rebecca Moss from JBH, Sophie Smith from North, and Amy Stone from Hard Numbers. They'll each speak for 5 minutes or so, and I'm going to keep watch, so good luck with that. And we'll be followed by a Q&A. If you have questions along the way, please drop them into the chat. The hashtag, as I said, if you're following on Twitter, is Waddscon. So first up, we're going to head to London to speak to Emma Thwaites. She's Director of Communications and Marketing at the Open Data Institute. The ODI was founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt, with the mission to help inspire people to innovate and share data. If you have questions for Emma, please drop them into the chat. Emma, the stage is yours. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hope it works. Here we go. I hope everybody can see that. And I am just going to go onto slideshow mode. So here we go. All working?
Sorry, yeah, good. You're good.
Great. Thank you. I'm good to go. All right. So hi, everybody. Emma Thwaites from the Open Data Institute. I'm going to talk to you about something that we call flagship stories, which are basically data stories, which you might expect as a data institute. So I recognise a lot of you might not know much about the ODI, but we are a non-profit based here in London, and we work with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. In practice, that means that we're all about improving data practices of organisations, tackling challenges, big challenges around data so that the whole data system works better, and gathering and creating research, evidence and knowledge about data and benefits. And part of that mission is, as you would imagine, telling stories with and about data. So this is our leadership team. Most importantly, they're Nigel Shadbolt, Tim Berners-Lee, our co-founders. So Tim, obviously inventor of the World Wide Web, and Nigel is an AI expert. Some would say the sort of most renowned AI expert in the world, certainly in the country, if not the world. Okay, so since 2012, we've told a range of stories, flagship stories, showing how data relates to the wider world through the lens of a consumer-facing issue, because data can be quite a dry and technical subject. So we recognised, in fact, it was part of my initial communication strategy for the ODI back in 2012, that we've got to be able to grab attention, the attention of stakeholders and influencers who may not be data specialists. And the best way to shine light on the data landscape or on data infrastructure is by showcasing a consumer issue. So the key features for us are that data is always the hero of a story because we're a data organisation. And we're always aiming to unlock new data sets or combine data sets in an unexpected way. But we also look for the consumer angle, as I say, the impact on people's lives that's revealed in that data. And we're always looking to produce something nice and visual, nice and strong to go with it, a piece of content or multiple pieces of content. So data visualizations, infographics, films, animations, those kinds of things. And we also look for a story in that data that works as much as possible across national, regional, and specialist media, and then to engage stakeholders as well. So these are integrated campaigns that we run around these stories. We're always looking for influence and to sort of shift the dial of people's understanding, but we do work within very tight budgets. It would be easy to think that these are very expensive. They're not. Okay, so here are some examples. I'm going to share the slides afterwards so you can dive into these. We did a story in very early days of the ODI 2012 around prescription savings that were possible within the NHS. we identified £250 million worth of potential savings. We told that story through an Economist feature in print online, and had various other media that followed. We did a similar thing with the story around peer-to-peer lending, which you can see a very old page from the FT on the left-hand side there. We got front and page 3 in the FT with that one. And then there were a couple of others around fire station closures in London and pollution in Heathrow. A couple of case studies just to finish up, coming a bit more up to date. So we produced a report about data around children's lives in the pandemic, pulled together a bunch of different data sets that had not been combined previously. We got a couple of organisations to open up some data for the first time, including Barnardo's, and produced a very credible research report, which generated engagement from more than 60 organisations online, but we're also crucially able to produce really good media coverage from that and a lot of downloads of the report. We did a similar piece with the role of data in unlocking the potential of social prescribing in November 2021, and revealed some quite impressive numbers around how social prescribing could relieve the burden on GPs, and particularly the NHS more widely. But all the time, the story that we're telling underneath all of these pieces is around data infrastructure and how investment and improvement around data infrastructure can help to unlock these benefits for society more widely. That's a snapshot of the coverage from that story in 2021, and some of the social media stakeholder engagement. And finally for today, I'd like to tell you about a story that we're just about to launch, and we're currently pitching to media. So this is another piece of research around food poverty this time. Food poverty is rising, but the data gaps mean that no one knows who is struggling and where. We brought together 12 data sets for the first time to reveal a regional and actually a local authority level picture of food poverty across the UK. The analysis reveals sharp differences in food poverty and provision of services and big gaps in the data infrastructure. And we've also developed a tool, a really lovely interactive data visualization that allows that drill down to local authority area. But obviously the story's under embargo. We haven't launched it yet. You can see a tiny little snapshot in the screen there of what the tool looks like. So the communications plan for this, the report, the data viz tool and film will be published on the ODI's website. We've got a stakeholder pack going out to key stakeholders in the network and funders, ODI funders. So strategic partners will be given an advanced copy of the report. We're currently trying to secure one national broadcast exclusive and one print exclusive. Of course, the risk with all of these stories is that the media take the lovely consumer-facing story and don't mention or credit the ODI. We work very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. We've obviously got a range of lovely regional stories to sell in as well, and some for the tech and data specialist media as well. And we've worked on this story, as we always do, with a range of partners, this time with 3 organisations: Mime Consulting, Frontier Economics, and our long-term agency partner, Allegory. And that report is due to launch next week. So that's it. I think I've more than used my time up, so I better stop sharing and move on to the next presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Emma. That was a really great presentation. First question from me: how does the ODI, or how does any organisation, persuade disparate parties to part with their data set and to participate in an initiative such as this? Because clearly it's when you combine disparate data sets you really have power. How does that happen?
Well, I should say that the ODI is quite practiced in persuading people to open up data. I mean, I think the key thing for me is you've got to be, if the data is not personal data, you've got a much higher chance of getting organisations to open it up or to share it. So, you know, obviously data operates on a spectrum from closed to shared to open. And a lot of the time, you know, if we can get organizations to move to the shared part of that lexicon, then we're doing really, really well. So it's not the case that in all of these stories, the organizations open the data to the world. Sometimes they just share it. And then we, you know, what we aim to do is to move them further along that data spectrum in the fullness of time. I should also say that a lot of this data is held by the third sector and the public sector. And it is either anonymized or it's about things like, for example, with the food poverty story, we got data about the locations of food banks from another, it's very relevant to today. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for supporting that local charity. You know, it's very a real tie in there. But they're obviously, that sort of data is non-personal data and is quite easy to share. So picking your data, picking your organization and recognizing where they are in terms of their journey towards data maturity and how comfortable they might feel about either opening or sharing their data.
That's good. Thanks to everyone that's posting questions. I'm sorry, a couple of people pointed out that we'd locked down the chat. It is now open, and thanks to people posting question here from John Clements. And maybe I'll ask this to the other participants as well. What criteria do you need for a story to be taken seriously or as credible when pitching to the media? I guess you're dealing with societal issues in the main, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's just that is always so difficult because we're obviously trying to pick an issue which is going to be topical. Like, we have to give the research time to happen, you know, because it's really important for the ODI as an institute to produce credible research. So, you know, the kind of minimal timeline is around 3 months. So if we're trying to be topical and prescient at the same time, if that makes sense. So, you know, when we were choosing food poverty and whether we could bring a different perspective or a new lens on that topic, there was a risk attached to that because people were already talking about food poverty at the point that we were choosing this story, and we didn't know what we were going to find. That's the other thing. So, you know, we always start off with a literature review and a little bit of a sort of light touch dive into the data to see if we can find an angle that media might be interested in. But you know what, it's like all pitches, we think we've got a really good story here, which I obviously haven't shared it in its entirety with you today, but it's a very difficult and complex landscape at the moment. And you know, it doesn't matter how great you think your story is, sometimes you don't get a bite. What I will say is that we more often than not get a lot of interest from the tech and particularly the data media. You know, they're the ones that, even if we don't get our mainstream coverage in the way that we would like to, we get our sector press engaged.
Okay, this is going to have to be the last question. It's a really good one from Tim Hudson. He's the head of comms at Land Aid. So when there's gaps in data, how do you approach telling a comprehensive story? He's got a particular issue here. His organization supports youth homeless charities, and there's always a difference in how homelessness is recorded by local authorities across the country.
Oh, that is so relevant to the food poverty story that we're working on at the moment. We've faced exactly the same challenge, and actually, one thing I will give away is that the ODI is going to be calling for a national data standard for food poverty. So, you know, there are gaps, and it makes the telling of the story difficult, but actually more important, it makes the addressing of the issue more challenging. And actually, in a way, that's our story around data infrastructure for this. It's like, you know, if we had better data, if we had better data and better tooling, we could target resources so much more effectively than we are doing. We could make better policy than we are doing. And was it Tim that asked that question?
Yeah, Tim Hudson.
Yeah, Tim, if you want to get in touch with me after today, I'm really happy to have a longer conversation about that, because that's a huge issue.
That's great. I'll connect the two of you if you're not already. Emma, thank you so much. That was a really great.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for such great questions as well. Really, really good. And if anybody else wants to contact me after, I'm really happy to take additional questions offline.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really appreciate your time. So next, we're going to go from London up to Manchester, and we're going to invite Rebecca Moss to join us. Rebecca, hello.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
So in the warm-up, Rebecca's dog was bouncing around the room.
She's gone now.
You've got that under control. That's great. We've also got the questions. We've also got the chat open. So if you've got any questions for Rebecca as we go, please drop them into the chat. Rebecca's PR director at JVH Digital Agency up in Manchester. She's going to talk to us about a framework for developing data stories and tools to help extract data.
Absolutely.
All yours, Rebecca.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to say it again. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Moss, Digital PR Director at JVH, a digital PR agency in Manchester. So this afternoon, I'm going to share my 3-step framework with you, which will help you turn spreadsheets full of data into really newsworthy stories. So let's get going. So for me, I know that data-led campaigns mean more coverage. I know that I can earn more coverage by pitching multiple stories from a single data set than I can by sharing a graphic or a comment or whatever that might be. But I'm no data scientist. I couldn't work for the ODI, for example, or a maths expert. In fact, I pretty much barely scraped a pass with my maths GCSE. I'm not even that savvy with a spreadsheet. So you might be thinking, right, why are you here talking to me about data today? So what I did was I needed to create a simple framework to help me find these stories within this spreadsheets full of data. So that's exactly what I did. I developed a framework which enabled me, and now you, to extract newsworthy data backstories from a set of statistics, get more stories out of every campaign that you run, and present data in much more compelling and digestible ways. So the first step of the framework is multipliers. And this is what I turn to first when I'm looking for insights from a completely raw data set. But what exactly are multipliers and how can we use them to get more coverage? Well, multipliers are a technique that help audiences or readers make sense of statistics. So last year, our online estate agent client decided to put Buckingham Palace up for sale. Their property experts valued this iconic landmark at a cool 4.9 billion quid. But this isn't a new story. If you worked in PR for long enough, you'll have seen stories like this time and time again. It wasn't going to grab the attention that I needed it to. So I decided to use the multiplier technique to tell a much more interesting story. So firstly, I looked at what percentage of public sector debt could be repaid by selling off Buckingham Palace, and also how much of the royal family finances could be repaid by selling this iconic building off. And that led to headlines just like this. So they're really timely, really newsworthy. So things like, is it time to put the palace up for sale? And how much could it wipe off the UK's debt? But we didn't just look at Buckingham Palace. We knew there was more stories within this data set that we had. So we valued the homes of 20 more world leaders. And to get more stories from this campaign, I used a multiplier to work out which world leader could afford to buy their own homes. And all I did here was divide the estate agent's property valuation for that particular property and divided it by the individual world leader's net worth to give me a whole new story. Multipliers are a really, really great way to create stories from just, a few lines of data. But a word of warning that you really need to know what headline you're looking for in the first place and to really interrogate that data to find the story that's the most compelling based on what your objectives are. So on to the next part of the framework, which is comparisons and groupings. So do you think you could imagine what 429,000 tonnes of CO2 might look like? I don't think that's something that I could imagine off the top of my head. So last year, we ran a campaign which predicted the amount of carbon emissions that were going to be released into the atmosphere due to our love for online shopping. So this campaign ticks all the boxes. It was great research, timely, shocking, newsworthy, all these things that we love in a data-led campaign. But we needed to get that messaging right. So we used the comparison and groupings technique to work out what 429,000 tonnes of carbon emissions would be in return flights between London and New York, and also that same weight in elephants. Forbes loved it, and so did the BBC. Both publications used our comparisons and groupings to make sense of that statistic. So they were using that information to convey that message across. And we see this all the time. So things like comparing deforestation to football pitches and the amount of tea that we drink in the UK to Olympic swimming pools. It's a really great technique to use if you're working with massive numbers. So spin is the third and final part of this framework, and it's quite possibly the most fun. Spin doesn't have to be negative. It's just about getting more stories out of every campaign. So for dog food brand Tails.com, we were tasked with generating coverage using some market research data. So it was a fairly standard survey of the general population who own dogs. And the survey asked, how often people treat everyone in their household. So thinking about dog treats, human treats, whatever that might be. On the surface, the stats were not very interesting. It was a bit disappointing when we got them back. So things like dogs owned by women get 41% of the treats in a household, dogs owned by men get 44%. It's a bit boring, doesn't really pass my so what test, in my own personal opinion. So does anyone remember the show It's Me or the Dog? So I had that show in my head when I was thinking about how we could pitch this set of data to the press. Then just by looking at the data in a little bit more detail, I spotted my angle. We can see here that women are about 3 times more likely to buy treats for their dog than treats for their partners. It's exactly the same data, but by knowing my angle and knowing my headline, it's me or the dog, I was able to create a more compelling story, which ended up with headlines just like this. So it's already more compelling, and I can already kind of see the headlines within that. So there are loads and loads of different ways to present data, but you have to make sure that what you're presenting is digestible, especially if, like me, you barely passed your maths GCSE. Percentages can be really, really tricky to present in a digestible way, though. And it's important that we spend that time presenting those percentages in the most compelling formats. And this was a really big problem for me because I was fed up of pretty much Googling how to present a percentage as a fraction, etc. So, sorry, hang on. So 9 out of 10 times, what we found was a journalist won't use a percentage in a headline. And I've got a really good example of that here. So a couple of headlines that I found in the press just recently was about environmental sustainability. And as you can see here, the journalist has used 1 in 5 versus the actual percentage in the headline. And that's what we need to do when we're pitching our data campaigns to the press. So in order for us to be able to do that, and because I'm not great at maths, I decided to create a percentage calculator that does this for us. So to make life easier, we created this calculator, which is an interactive tool that you can actually use to make your percentages more poignant. And all you need to do is kind of slide the slider along to find the percentage that you want to present, and it'll spit out some exact numbers of how you can kind of present that same percentage in more compelling ways for your headlines. So if you want to try that out for yourself, you can go to jbh.uk/calc, and you'll be taken straight to that calculator, and you can have a little play around with it yourself. And I've also pinned that to the top of my Twitter profile, which you can find at BexMoss, and you'll be able to go directly from there. And I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'd love you to share it as well if you could as well. But yeah, thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, fire them over.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Do you want to close your deck, and we'll come back on and we'll have a chat. If you've got any questions for Rebecca, chuck them into the chat. Thanks for sharing that. Nice digital leave behind for everyone that's in today's session. So Rebecca, how'd you go? What's your framework? How'd you go from a creative idea, as you showed in that first one, having a creative idea, to creating, if you like, a data story? That's a data-led story rather than exploring a data set. Have you got a specific process within JBH for doing that?
I think it's a case of just really sitting with that data for a while. It's not something that jumps out at you straight away. It can literally be, 1 minute you're looking at the story and thinking, hang on, how am I going to pitch this? And then going into your data thinking, this is where I want to pitch it. This is who I want to pitch it to. This is the reason I'm pitching it. Does my data support this? Is there anything else I can find from that data set to support what I'm trying to say? So you kind of have your story in your mind already, and then you go looking for the data. And then the opposite way, you can do it the opposite way as well, by interrogating that data set. So asking it questions, what do I want to know? What things are really, really important to me, important to the audience and important to the client, that I can extract from this data set? So for me, it's sitting with that data set and letting it takes longer than you would expect, I think, is what I'm trying to get at there.
Okay, but it's a great example of data modeling to create that story in that first example, and actually link it directly to a client or an organization's product and service. You by your own admission, you said several times you're not a maths geek, you're not a data geek. Have you any recommendations for people? And it tends to be normative that in public relations people are very good at creative skills and soft skills, not necessarily so good at maths and so forth. Have you any tips for how people can develop in that area and things that they can do?
This is really annoying, but I'm just going to say practice. that's like really such a cop-out question, isn't it? There are definitely resources out there that you can help to find, different formulas in Google Sheets to help you kind of just play around with data, find data sets online that you can use for free, and try and just see if you can get any stories out of them, rather than worrying about if it's for a client or not. Just doing it in your own time and using a data set that potentially you're really interested in as well. Something for free out there, and just see if you can pull data stories out of it. I think as well, sorry, go on.
Well, no, it's sorry, I was going to move on to the next question. What if you have a situation where Sophie's asked this question? You have an underwhelming data set or an underwhelming story, that won't create a headline. What do you do in that situation?
It's always a risk, and we had that with the Tails.com example. It came back and it just wasn't what we expected. It wasn't what we wanted to see. So you sat there thinking that you're scratching your head going, what am I going to do with this? So again, it's a case of just sitting with it and thinking, what do I want to present first? Forgetting about the data in some respects and thinking about what story I want to present. Does my data support that? If it doesn't support it, don't fudge it. Don't try and make it work. I think sometimes that's the risk with market research surveys, which is why I would prefer using free public data sets, because you're not running that risk. You're not spending all that money on market research surveys that potentially could not tell the story that you're wanting to present for your client.
There's a lot of data already out there. Janet Hare actually asked, where did you get the data from for the Tails.com example? Yeah,
that was a market research survey. So that came through probably somebody like Censuswide, I think, if I remember correctly. So a company like that the client,
Okay. Questions from Abby. Have you ever had pushback from clients because you push data too hard to create a story?
I wouldn't say pushback on when we're in the outreach phase. I'd say when we're selling the idea into them, they are more interested in kind of what the headline, how it's going to present their brand. And I think it's down to us to create the data sets and create the data stories that are going to present them in the best light. So we're not just going to say, like, we've got this piece of data, we're going to pitch it out. It's more a case of how does this story represent your brand? And this is the reason why, this is the information to support it. And this is how you're going to get cut through against your competitors. So using a bit of competition to try and get your idea signed off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, great question from Laura Sutherland up in Scotland. How do you measure the outcome of work, presumably as you would for any other campaign, right?
Yeah, so in terms of coverage, so how many hits we got, how many times the brand was mentioned in that piece of coverage, that's really important. And of course, well, links as well, SEO links for SEO purposes, that's something that we'd always report on. I think it's quite interesting sometimes when you look at the coverage from data, have they just used one single stat from it, or is that piece of coverage more valuable because it's a really, really big piece looking at every single part of your data set? So I think you can judge it based on the amount of your data that they use, or whether it's just a slip in with a small link back to your client or something like that.
Final question here from Alex Waddington, no relation, but good friend. Do you have data analysts or data scientists in-house, or is it general practitioners who manage this?
So we do have a data team at JBH, but all the team are well versed in creating data stories for the larger big data set campaigns that will go into our data analyst team. But for anything kind of smaller and reactive, that would be something that the general PR execs would work on.
Okay, well, one final thing from Gemma Petman. Gemma asks about the relationship between data stories and case studies. Is it stronger to have numbers and human stories together? I think it is. Your headline example showed that, right? I mean, the visualization of 1 in 5 versus a percentage.
Absolutely, yeah. I think case studies, if you talk about personal case studies, it always adds strength to any PR story or whatever you've got. And I'm a big proponent of a good case study to support any story. So if you can have your data set plus a case study, I think you're strengthening that pitch even more. You're strengthening that story for the journalist even more. You've done more work for them. So I think they are probably going to be more likely to cover it than if you didn't have that way.
And your point's really been made about visualizing, presenting numbers in a human way. Really good. Rebecca, really great presentation. Thank you very much for your time. We are going to go now from Manchester to Newcastle. And next up, we've got a former Waddscon colleague. I'd like to welcome Sophie Smith. Sophie, you're there. Hello. How are you doing?
I'm good.
So after leaving Waddscon, Sophie joined North, where she's a content and PR exec. She pitched really hard for this slot, and she's going to share some consumer examples of data storytelling. You're not nervous at all, are you, Sophie?
No, this is not one of my first talks. But
Right. Do you want to bring up your slides? We're really great to have you.
Cool. Lovely. Can you see that?
Yeah. Do you want to put it in? That's it. You're good. Good to go. I'm going to go mute.
Cool. So as Stephen said, ex-Wads employee, but also now at North, looking at data tools, accessing data and examples of data journalism. So as we know from this whole conference, data can be found anywhere and everywhere. So literally any element of your life could become a data point in someone else's when collecting data for a campaign. But where can we find this data? So a few different places we look here at North include search volume tools and Google Trends, surveys, freedom of information requests, web scraping and APIs, public data sets, and even your own website data. So if you want to access these different types of data, so for example, for search volume tools, you will look at things like Ahrefs and SEMrush, which you might already have access to if you work in SEO. And then Google Trends, which is a free website online, which gives you search volume for different keywords and trending topics. These work really well for reactives if you want additional data to go along with your story, and you can fire it out in the morning. Pretty easy to collect. And then surveys, which we love here at North. So you can create your own survey with the Leadership Factor or Census Wide or another website that you might have contact with. And if you can't afford a survey, because it can be quite expensive, you can look on YouGov, and quite often they already have a survey out there. So I found one for Halloween campaign, which was exactly what I would have asked if I'd have been able to afford the campaign for the client. So it was perfect, it was already there available. And then freedom of information requests. So the Freedom of Information Act gives you the right to get in touch with a public authority, so you can write an email or ring them. So this can be government department, local councils or schools. Some examples include the MP expenses, the most popular baby names that year, so you can find out the list of babies and the names that year. So these are really good, and they'll usually give you the data if you ask. I don't think they can say no. And then web scraping. So this is retrieving information and data from different websites online. You can actually use Excel to do so. So if you go to data from web and function and type in the URL, it will actually export all of the data from the website into a Google sheet or an Excel sheet, and you can work through that. But if the data is too big, then you would use an API to scrape, and an API basically requests and then receives the data for you. And online, there's a lot of different APIs that are already made, and you can filter down. So these include dictionaries, social media platforms. So Twitter actually has their own API, which you can pull data from on a weekly basis. Same goes for flight information, news sites, anything like that. There's a famous Spotify API which pulls most popular songs in different types of playlists, which I'm sure anyone working in digital PR has seen quite often. And then public data sets. I saw in the comments that there was a few questions around these. So there's loads of different types of public data sets that you can access. There's Office of National Statistics, Met Office, government sites. Usually they just have data sets that you can download, and quite often they're free. If not, you can spend a bit of money to download them. But we've got a whole list on the North website, which I'll share at the end, where you can find these. And then the last one, which I think is quite underused and is really beneficial if you want to create a story, you can use your own website data. So this could include product searches on your website, Google Analytics, which includes demographics and things like that. And then also newsletters. If you've got people signing up to your email newsletter, you can use all of that for stories as well. And quite often they're very relevant for you because obviously it is your own data, so it'll really tie in nicely to your clients. So a few examples of where these have been used in data stories. So the first one is actually one I did for a client here at North, where we surveyed 2,000 people to ask them what they were most worried about when it came to their holidays that year. And we got 18 pieces of coverage, which mostly focused on the COVID element of the story, but the number one came out that people just could not afford holidays this year. But that did really well. And again, surveys always get picked up by journalists. I don't think you'll ever not see a survey campaign out there. And then the second one, so Oliver Bonus, they used their own website data to see what people were searching for. And they found a 1,300% increase in people searching for sea-themed interiors. So they turned this into an aesthetic and it landed loads of coverage, including Metro, which is the example you can see here. And then Ocean Bottles used loads of different data sets from online, so publicly available ones, and also did some web scraping on websites that had data, but obviously was not in a data set already. And then they created a ranking based on water samples and quality to find the best places to go while swimming in the UK, and also included it in a nice visual, which you can see here. And then the most used emoji campaign, might have seen this on Twitter a while back. This is obviously a popular one because it's quite a nice visual. They used the Twitter API to track, use geo-tracking to see what were the most popular emojis in different countries across the world. And then obviously turned it into quite a nice visual, because I think if you'd have seen all the emojis as a list, you might not have wanted to read all of it, but as a map, it's quite visually pleasing, obviously more digestible for the whole data. And then the last one, which I think is a very popular one and some people's favourites, which is the most popular baby names of the year. So this will be coming out very soon, I'm sure. But this is freedom of information. So you can pull the list of all the different names of babies that were born that year, and then obviously find the most popular ones to create your campaign. And then a special shout out. So Surfers Against Sewage found the most amount of rubbish on beaches and what brands they were from. So they obviously didn't find the data online, they actually collected it themselves. So they worked with 4,000 different volunteers to collect 12 months worth of data, and then found which brands had the most amount of rubbish on beaches across the UK. So a good example of, if it's not out there, collect it yourself. And then here you'll find on the website, on the North website, we've got a full extensive guide. So all of these that I've included here, but also links to all the different tools and the data sets that you can find online. So anyone who's asking in the chat about where to find them, you can have a look here and you'll be able to find them there. So
do you want to close your deck and we'll have a chat? If you have any questions for Sophie, post them in the chat. The emoji graphic map, it's great. I also really nice data really nice example of data visualization that I might nick and use myself. Also really like the surface against sewage data visualization. That's just really great example. So questions already come up from Vicky Edwards, and no doubt others will ask. When you're using third-party data, and if it's not necessarily public or available, if you're scraping, how do you manage issues around rights and copyright?
Yep, so I think any publicly available data you can use anywhere, use as it's public, you should have access to it. But to make sure, if you're wanting to pitch it to a journalist, that they'll obviously give you the credit for the story. I think you look into the manipulation of it, the cleaning, how you've used the data and things like that, as well as if you want to turn it into a visual, because I think if you add a visual to go alongside data, then obviously they'll give you the credit there. But usually public available data is available for you to use in your stories and everything like that.
So disclosure is the key thing there.
Yeah.
You mentioned there some of these data sets are quite literally in the example of surface against sewage dirty, or it's not necessarily clean data that you can use directly. How do you clean it up?
So if it's not a lot of data, you can usually use Excel to tidy up yourself. So you want to get rid of any duplicates, any irrelevant data, any outliers, anything like that. Also, if you've got missing data, see if you can try and fill the gaps from other data online. If you've got thousands of rows of data, then usually you'd want to look into coding, which obviously if you've not got the skills. I did a bit of R code at uni, and I think I should really refresh my memory about that because it'd be quite handy. Usually if you work with a data scientist, they should be able to clean it using code for thousands of different rows. Okay,
cool. I asked Rebecca before you this question. I'm going to ask you the same. What do you do if you can't find a story amongst data?
Yeah, I think reiterate what Rebecca said, kind of maybe step back from the data and look at what your overall story was about, what you're wanting from it. If you can't find it in the data, don't force it. Maybe look elsewhere on how you can pitch the story. Can you look at case studies, anything like that, expert comment, maybe step away from the data if it's not relevant. If not, go back to the drawing board, have a look at the different areas that you can find data sets, that sort of thing.
Question from Alex Waddington. What are the top tools that you use in your data stack? You've mentioned Excel already. You listed quite a few web tools though.
Yeah, obviously in SEO we love Ahrefs and SEMrush, so I think we use them on a weekly basis whenever we do reactive work. That's quite a popular one for us. Also, I love surveys. I've done a couple of survey campaigns now, and they always work really well. And journalists love it, even if it's one that you've done or if it's YouGov, they usually pick it up because they're interested in them. I think we've done quite a few where we have scraped websites. I really like APIs as well. The Twitter one, and we did a TripAdvisor piece where we scraped all of the different reviews for things to do to find the best sunsets in the UK. Every time someone had basically mentioned the word sunset, and I think that's a really clever way of finding the different locations. So
where is the best place for a sunset in the UK?
I think it was the top of the London Eye. Very niche.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more glorious sunsets around the country. I'd say Cullercoats Beach up near us in Newcastle. There's several people have asked if you can, if the presentations are going to be available. We'll record all the Waddscon session. We'll load them up to YouTube, so you'll be able to see this. And if you contact each of the presenters on Twitter, or I know they've shared their information in the chat, I'm sure they've been more than willing to share the decks. And many have already said that they will. Sorry, coming back, Sophie, just talk a minute about visualization and that human aspect. You said yourself that the emoji story worked because it was so visual. What's the creative process from going from data to a visualization like that?
I think obviously if you're going to have a look at how you think this would be digestible and kind of start there, what type of graphic do you think will be most suitable for the data that you have? Obviously it can be graphs, it can be world maps like the emoji one, it can be a literal graphic. So we've done a Halloween one where we've turned data into an image of a character. So anything like that will work. Just take a look at your data and think how is this going to be best presented for people to digest, and kind of go from there. And if you need to ask your team what you think would be best for them as well, always ask. I love asking my team questions. What
does your bench look like in terms of team? Do you have data scientists do you have data visualizers? Do you have designers?
So we work with a designer here at North. We work most closely just digital PR team, trying to get their opinion on things, and a data scientist as well. Well, we call data journalist if we do need any coding, anything like that. But yeah, we kind of just work. We're quite close knit. We're small over at North, so we're quite open to helping each other out in the group chats.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Sophie, if I could ask you, would you share your detail? A couple of people have asked if they can get in touch afterwards and if they can see your deck. I don't know if you're going to share your deck.
Yeah.
But, if you could you stick it into the chat? We've had some nominations here, actually, for the best sunset. Daryl Sperry, Bournemouth, Gemma Penman, Whitstable. Actually, we've got the PR team for the London Eye who adore you. So well done there. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
Great
Bye.
session. See you again soon. Right, we're back now. We're going back now for the last session to London, to Amy Stone from Hard Numbers. Amy, hello.
Hey, hiya, you right?
Yeah, good, really good. Thanks for joining us. Amy's senior comms consultant at Hard Numbers, and she's going to talk about B2B examples of data storytelling. It's the one aspect. We've covered society, we've covered consumer data. Amy's here to fill the gap on B2B. Amy,
lovely.
All yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephen. Hi, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, I work at Hard Numbers. So just a really quick introduction for anyone that doesn't know who we are. We are a performance-driven marketing and communications agency that exists to bridge the gap between communications and sales. So today I am here to talk to you through 3 case studies from my own work at Hard Numbers that are examples of data storytelling that will hopefully provide you with some inspiration on how to use data for your next media story. So I want to start off with a public data example because everyone loves a freebie. Sophie already gave you some really great examples just now of data sources that you can use here. Think Office of National Statistics, government figures, census data. All of this is freely available to you, and it is well-respected data by journalists as well. So there are 2 ways that I've used public data before. The first is creating a story around analysis of data from ONS. So there's a huge amount of stats out there that people have never seen before, which means a really great opportunity as PRs to find fresh angles on topics that are really familiar. But my best tip for doing this is to get ONS to find that data for you. Nothing is more mind-numbing than scrolling through those websites looking for something you're hoping to find. They have an email address that you can send the data request to, and then they'll just ping what you need right back to you. It saves me a ton of time, so I highly recommend doing that. The second way that I've used public data is to provide a larger campaign with a local angle. So our biggest fintech client, Mambu, was really keen to reach more consumer media with one of their latest reports, which admittedly was a tough ask for a SaaS cloud banking platform, but we gave it a shot and we could push it out to broadcast. So we knew that broadcasters really rarely run a story that isn't relevant to their patch. So we went to ONS to find hyperlocal figures on the number of bank branch closures by town over the last 10 years. So adding this really small but local bit of data to our report pitching actually helped us to secure 9 regional radio interviews, something that Mambu had never been able to do before, and something that we knew that this report wouldn't have been able to achieve by itself. So this data that we found, it wasn't new, it certainly wasn't groundbreaking by any stretch, but going to the effort of finding it helped to show journalists the relevance of our global report to their local audience, which is a struggle I personally have come up against time and time again. So moving on to the next case study, this one is on internal data. So it's been my experience with some of my clients that they're often sitting on a gold mine of data and they really have no idea what they've got. And this is definitely the case for our client Circle Loop. So after a bit of digging with them, we actually found out that their data showed how often and how long their customers are on the phone doing their jobs, which I appreciate sounds quite dry. Like Rebecca said, what's the so what of that data? But just because it's B2B doesn't mean it has to be boring. We turned this into a story about the UK's chattiest towns for business. And Circle Loop's data could actually pinpoint the number of calls made per town. So that meant we had numerous local angles to pitch to regional media all across the country. The ranking table that we built, which we dubbed the Chatterbox Matrix, sat on their website to drive traffic, and then we started pitching and pit town against town, north versus south. That's always a classic. And we had all over which areas of the chattiest business based on our data, and regional media absolutely loved it. We got coverage spread across the country. They loved pitting towns in their regions against each other in articles. And because the data was owned by our client, Circle Loop was name checked in every article that was published, which is always half the battle if you're not a household name. So the key takeaway from this one is that it can be a real challenge as PRs to get your clients to think about the data that they just have and generate every day in terms of a story as it could be pushed out to media, but be persistent, and it can be well worth it. Plus, this one is also a freebie, so another bonus. So the last one I have to tell you about is external data example. Working with a research agency to commission your own survey, you can get quite creative with the angles and ideas you can come up with. The slight catch with this one is this one's not free. This one costs a bit of money. The larger the research you commission, the more expensive it's going to be. But if you have the budget, it can be well worth the investment. So my example for you on this one is research done by Sensei, which is an autonomous retail technology provider. They provide this technology to stores. If anyone's familiar with Amazon Go, stores. It's exactly like that. They wanted to show retailers how ready the UK is for this autonomous technology, but they also wanted to have just a little bit of fun with it as well. So to do that, we tapped into a wider cultural angle. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the stereotype that Brits love a queue, especially recently, lots of long queuing. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, Sensei's technology is all about removing queues from the shopping experience. So we kind of used that to flip it on its head, and in our research asked the British public a really important question: will you miss queuing? And 1 in 5 people said yes, they would, which we thought was very odd, but was brilliant for our story. So we weren't complaining at all. I mean, this for us was a classic David and Goliath moment. We were up against Amazon, who absolutely dominate autonomous retail as a topic. They have it completely covered. But this goes to show that for us, that it's all about getting the right data to tell the best story. Because one slightly tongue-in-cheek stat poking some fun at Brits could get you reams of coverage against even the biggest name in retail. And that is everything that I have for you.
Brilliant. Amy, do you want to close your deck and
Sure.
come and have a chat? As ever, if you've got questions for Amy, stick them in the chat. Amy, so public data, own data from an organization and a survey proving that B2B data can tell stories in B2B equally as well as consumer, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's obviously obvious benefits of using public data and internal data is that they don't cost you any money. So that's one benefit to people that don't have big budgets and can't splash out on huge research pieces. But there is absolutely no reason that a cost-effective option versus a very expensive option shouldn't get you the same amount of coverage. It's what you plan and put into it, and how you ultimately pitch out to journalists.
Can you talk us through that first example then of where you took it was from Mambo, wasn't it? Where you took a personal finance story, overlaid a public data set. How did you do that? How did you get access to that? Just quite tactically.
Yeah, so we quickly realised that it wasn't local enough to go to broadcast media in that space. So it needed something that we could break down and go to by town. The obvious place for us to go to that would also have consumer relevance was looking at bank branch closures by towns. And we looked on ONS. Most of the time when we're doing things like that, it's kind of a shot in the dark to just, this is what we think we would like to have for this, and let's see if we can find it. And it's kind of like, yes, thank goodness it's there. And I think like one of the other ladies mentioned, if you can't find it, back to the drawing board, try and find something else that's still going to give you that local hook. And it was just a case of looking on the website, finding what we needed, writing it down and getting it split into the regions so that we could take that straight to that journalist in for that publication.
So when you're dealing, and that's quite experimental, right? There's quite a degree of risk there. You didn't know what the outcome was going to be.
Yeah.
How did you get buy-in to do that, to spend that money doing that research, or internal research, albeit?
So this was just ONS data. This didn't cost anything. All it cost was our time to just take the sort of an hour to search for it and find that. Again, with the other piece that I mentioned in that section about where I emailed ONS, that cost £150 for them to spend a couple of hours, spit some data back out of me that I needed. Like, so none of this is a particularly expensive option. And if you've got the time, that's the one thing. It's time consuming. And if you don't know specifically what you're looking for, where to find it, that can take some time. But if you've got the time, it can be well worth doing it.
Brilliant. Question: how do you find the best journos to pitch for a story? This is from Andy. Once you've got it.
That's a good question. I mean, it is getting to know what journalists cover for what subject. So, if you read a newspaper, you're a particular fan of The Guardian or a particular fan of The Times, the articles that are writing about fintech, say, or retail, figure out who those correspondents are, who are the people writing about those stories, because those are the ones that you need to reach with them. And using databases like Gorkana and Roxhill is really useful to find to do that in a more digital way rather than manual. But it really is. I would always say it to anybody that is within my team: watch the news, read the news, consume the news, and see who's saying what, because those are the people that you want to take the story.
Well, fashion media relations. Are there any, is data a category that are the journalist beats for data yet?
There are, but it's still very niche and very much in the trade space, and it's a lot around sort of data privacy, data ethics, those kind of things. You wouldn't get a journalist that would just cover general data and take any sort of survey story, but if that's where you need to sort of think about what the lead is. So for example, for the Sensei one, that was very retail space, and for the Mambu one, that was very fintech space. So we had to sort of direct them in those avenues. However, if you have got something you can comment on about data privacy and data ethics, then those narratives are definitely growing across media.
Question, the stories you've all presented all have or you're bringing a B2B topic into a consumer domain, albeit with quite a lot of creativity. And that can be quite a stretch for in fact, someone's raised this, that can be quite a stretch for B2B business to be able to take or consume that level of risk. How do you manage that process? How do you persuade your clients to do this?
I think it's been pretty transparent with them from the very beginning, like of what the different outcomes can be, almost like a bronze, silver, gold. You know, if we don't take this risk, the sort of bronze level of coverage we'll get is your sort of standard trades, and it'll still be really good coverage, but it won't be, you know, the next silver level, which if we do take a little bit more risk and get a bit more creative, we might be able to reach a slightly higher caliber and so on. And it's just being honest with them and being like, look, if you want to take the risk, we're here for it. This is what we're going to do. We can talk you through it, and we'll hold your hand the whole way through until we get there. But if you don't want to take the risk, again, absolutely fine. Just to manage your expectations, the coverage won't be as dazzling. It will still be good. You'll still have lots of it, but it won't be the Guardian or the Daily Mail.
You've talked a lot about getting data sets out of the UK government or UK public services. You've got, and Sarah's asked this question, you've got any view of where you can access data from further afield in Europe, for example?
I think freedom of information request is a really good way to go for just anything that's not government related. And again, it's not something that everyone thinks of immediately off the top of their head, and it does take some time, so it's not something to do last minute. If we're looking at sort of health data as well, really easy to get from World Health Organization, and that will be global, and you can break that down by continents of Europe, I think as well, and that's health ones are always good to go to journalists with, you know, statistics like that. So there's never a limit on where you can find these things. It doesn't just have to be government stuff. I mean, I think Sophie mentioned the Met Office, like, is another great one where the statistics, if you could fit something like that, and it's different, it's unique, and the more quirky you can get with this stuff and find those stats that people haven't seen before, that's the best way to do it.
Have you any particular tools that you use at Hard Numbers to analyze data sets and find the story? What's your tech stack look like?
To analyze data sets, I mean, if it comes from data that we've created ourselves, you know, it's their standard Excel sheet going through and trying to find the best stats that have come out of it, maybe putting them into a visual graph, so sometimes that's a little bit clearer rather than looking at a page of numbers. But otherwise, with going through internal data sets, I think you can use tools, and I'm not disparaging the use of tools, but you know, there's nothing that's sort of better than going through it yourself and getting to understand it. If you've got to build a story, you really need to understand that data, and having something that just spits out some stats for you doesn't necessarily mean that you can understand or find the story that's in your data, because sometimes that's what you have to do, is look for the story in the data. It might not jump out at you immediately, but it will be there. Just taking the time to sift through it, and it is a process, and it's always something that for any of our clients that are using data, part of our timeline, a huge chunk of it will be data analysis and taking the weeks that are needed to go through it and find exactly what is needed to make this the best story that does land in the Guardian and the Daily Mail.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much. And how you get B2B stories into the Daily Mail, what an incredible presentation. Amy, you completely nailed it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing this edition of Waddscon to a close. There's a couple of points in the chat. Emma Thwaites from the ADI said you'll often get passed around from journo to journo with data stories. Clearly need to be persistent. She also said go and contact the ADI if you're looking for international data, because they work globally and have lists. So there you go, we're done. We've covered an incredible lot of ground today, examples of data used to shine a spotlight on societal issues, tools, consumer, and finally with Amy, their B2B examples. We'll be back in October. We're going to do a session on owned media and probably promoted media in November. Until then, I want to thank all our speakers, Emma, Rebecca, Sophie, and Amy, and I want to thank you all for joining and helping raise another 500 quid for my local food bank. It's much appreciated. Thanks to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.